This is the show where we talk about Arkansas history, all different aspects of Arkansas history, art, history, books, all sorts of things. And
well, Arkansas culture and a variety of topics.
And then every month we have a special guest and to talk about either a book or a art or something, some sort of collecting thing. So we're glad to have our guest here tonight.
Tim, you have chosen a topic on French missionaries in Arkansas, and particularly Arkansas Post comes to mind. Arkansas Post was the early French settlement, and then the first territorial capital and state capital, but not state capital, territorial capital of Arkansas. It's an old place. Why don't you talk about Arkansas Post a little bit?
Well, of course, it was founded in 1686. Who founded Arkansas Post? That's a trivia question for you.
Well, it was an offshoot from the LaSalle expedition, but Henri de Tonty was, I guess you would say, the founder of Arkansas Post.
Yeah, and then of course it was the first permanent European settlement west of the Mississippi River.
Yes, we tend to forget about that. It's really quite ancient.
Have you been down to the memorial, the national memorial, the park, and then of course there's a state park right in front of the national memorial? Have you been down there recently?
Well, it's been a few years, but it's a really nice place. It's beautiful, really green. There's a lot of water around. Of course, the water was both a blessing for Arkansas Post and to its detriment in that it flooded all the time.
Right.
It's a beautiful national memorial, and it has nice interpretive exhibits. I urge people to go. And there's also a nearby county museum that deals with Arkansas Post too.
It's really a nice thing, a nice place. I was down there, and I think the last time I was there was 2014, and it was I think they had just updated maybe the building or renovated the building or updated the exhibits or something. I really enjoyed it.
Well, Arkansas Post is also a part of American history in that it was the site of one of two Revolutionary War conflicts fought west of the Mississippi River. The Revolutionary War contest involved a raid by an Englishman by the name of Colbert, along with his Chickasaw allies, and he attacked at 2:30 in the morning. I just think it's amazing. This rendering here, which of course I'm sure it leaves a lot to be desired as far as accuracy is concerned, but he attacked at 2:30 in the morning, and I just find that amazing how they were able to find their way. They didn't come the entire distance by river. They came overland, and there was quite a few of them. So it's really remarkable to me that they were able to attack at 2:30 in the morning. Also, an interesting aspect of this raid is that it occurred after the Revolutionary War had officially ended. So, but they of course did not know about it. We tend to forget how extremely slow communications were in early Arkansas, actually all the way up until the 20th century in some ways.
How big was the raid, that Colbert raid?
I can't remember the exact numbers of people involved. They were not huge by any means. However, some 300 cannon shells were fired during the conflict. That raid leaves us with a a piece of, it's not folktale, it's not myth, but it's an interesting story in that Saracen, a half Quapaw, half French member of the tribe, was able to mount a sort of a counterattack. And here's what, here's how Judge Buzz Arnold, U.S. Federal Judge Morris S. Arnold, who has built a reputation as one of the great historians of Arkansas colonial history. Here's how Judge Arnold writes. It appears altogether probable that Saracen, the name of this Indian hero at the battle, was a hero of the Revolutionary War battle of 1783 at Arkansas Post. The commandant's letter of that year, written to the governor and describing the battle and its aftermath, speaks of an unnamed Quapaw who threw a tomahawk into the midst of Colbert's band at the time that Colbert released the women and children whom he had captured during the raid. By the late colonial period, many years later, a Spanish commander is already referring to Saracen as famous. And in 1824, the Protestant missionary Timothy Flint reports meeting Saracen and that he was a dignified old man, and he comments on the story. But by the time Timothy Flint came along in 1824, the story is morphing into one of the many variants that it has taken. There is a grave in Pine Bluff at St. Joseph's Cemetery, which purports to be the grave for Saracen, and it very well could be, although the grave shows up after his death, as I understand it. So, Arkansas Post, yeah, it's an important site in Arkansas history, and it goes back a long, long way.
Of course, the French who settled Arkansas Post were Catholic. And do you know what the name of the chapel was at Arkansas Post?
No, I do not.
St. Ambrose.
St. Ambrose.
Mm-hmm.
No, I did not know that.
It's interesting because the diocesan archives here with the Catholic Church, they have some of the records from Arkansas, the baptisms, the original ledger from Arkansas Post of the baptisms. So it's interesting to look at.
Yeah, a goodly number of the early French language records have been studied, and some of them translated and published.
Well, you mentioned Buzz Arnold. I think he's probably the one who really started the resurgence of the study of Arkansas Post and its history and that period and pre-Arkansas history.
I think all of us owe a great debt to Federal Judge Morris S. Arnold, native of Texarkana, born into an old legal family there in Texarkana. His brother, Richard S. Arnold, became a federal judge and was even mentioned for the U.S. Supreme Court. They were viewed as two brilliant brothers when they were growing up. The story is that when they were children, if they didn't want their mother to understand what they were into, that they would speak Latin. Judge Arnold is not only fluent in his English is wonderful. He's such a good writer. His Spanish and French from that time period, 17th and 18th century French and Spanish, his facility with that and his willingness to travel to Paris and Seville and other places has allowed Judge Arnold to pretty much create the field of colonial history. I don't want to imply that there weren't others, because there were some, like Stanley Fay, who wrote some. Gilbert Dinn, a professor of history out in Colorado, published some material on early colonial Arkansas, and he wrote a piece on the battle, for example, of Arkansas Post during the Revolutionary War. But Judge Arnold really has done a fantastic number of books and has really expanded our knowledge of the colonial period so vastly. You see two of his books on the screen here, Colonial Arkansas. I really urge people to take a look at Colonial Arkansas. It's written really appealingly. It's very accessible, and I think it would be fun for anyone to take a look at.
I think there might be a French missionary just rang my doorbell.
I bet it's a Jesuit. Go take a look at it.
But of course, there's also Buzz also did the Arkansas Post of Louisiana book not too long ago, and both of these, and I think all of his books are published by the University of Arkansas Press.
I think so.
But the Arkansas Post of Louisiana is really nice. It's really nice illustrations, some of them in color. So if you don't have these books for your library, I suggest getting them. They're really, really excellent.
You know, all of us in Arkansas grow up knowing and hearing about the name, the Quapaw Indians, but most of us really don't know a whole lot about that, those first Arkansans. And Judge Arnold has written a book called The Rumble of a Distant Drum, which covers the Quapaws from 1673 to 1804. And it is a fabulous book, along with all of his others. It's so good.
You know, one thing about the Arnolds, which has nothing to do with Arkansas Post, but I find interesting, is that they were growing up in Texarkana, and they were there during that serial killer period in Texarkana. Was that in the 40s, I believe? And then the movie, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, was based on that. And there was an article about Buzz and his brother Richard in was that Look magazine or Life?
Well, there was an article, I think it was in Look, about this murderer in Texarkana around 1950, and he was a serial murderer, and the town was indeed terrified by this. And so there was an article, a national article. This received national publicity all the time. And there was a piece, I think, in Look, and it included a photograph of Mrs. Arnold with her two boys leaving the home in the evening, going to a safer locale because her husband was gone, and interesting.
Well, I'm excited to have our guest here tonight because, as you know, I research Catholicism in Arkansas, but I usually concentrate on the beginning of the establishment of the diocese in 1843. So I don't know a whole lot about Catholicism in pre-Arkansas. So I'm glad to have our guest, Linda Jones, here, who has just written a book, The Shattered Cross, about French Catholic missionaries on the Mississippi River, 1699 to 1725. So Linda, welcome. We're glad to have you here.
So glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can sort of talk a little bit, and then I think we have some slides from maybe that you want to talk about, and I'll start sharing my screen again after that. But we're just so glad to have you here and so excited about the book. How long have you been working on this?
Well, that's always a hard question to answer. I really started working on the topic about 1995. George Sabo introduced the topic to me. I was doing a master's in anthropology at the University of Arkansas and worked in the World Languages department and thought I was going to be an archaeologist, but my body can't take that much of archaeology. So George said to me one day, well, what about doing something on the first French missionary at Arkansas Post? And I was like, there were French people at Arkansas Post, or rather there were French people in Arkansas. And of course, this was about the time when Buzz Arnold's book, Colonial Arkansas, came out. And so as Buzz has written in his own work, it had a curious ring to my ears to hear this term French Arkansas, French Colonial Arkansas. So I started working on it in 95 pretty much, or 96, somewhere in there. George pointed me towards Father Nicolas Foucault and also the letters that were in Paris. So I first went to Paris and was able to read the authentic, real letters written by Davion that described Father Foucault's murder. And then I was also able to go to Quebec and start working in the archives in Quebec. The interesting thing about those archives was that was at a time when the internet didn't exist very well. And so everything was done by index card. And so I exhausted everything I could find on Foucault, which was not very much, and started looking at this priest named Bergier. I thought, well, who is Bergier? Because they had a ton of stuff on Bergier. So that's pretty much where I started. And then that, of course, continued on until I published the book this past December. I put it away for a while to get tenure at the U of A because my area at the U of A is instructional technology, but picked it back up in about 2006 when tenure was secured and I wanted to move into this fascinating topic.
You have a train going behind you, Linda?
There's a train and there's also a great gray tree frog singing outside as well.
Well, that's probably what some of the things, well, not the train, but the tree frog they might have heard at Arkansas Post.
Absolutely.
Well, you bet they did. You bet they did. They probably had him in their cabin.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, I did not know anything about this. I mean, this is really quite early. One of the things about your book that I found so astonishing was that the Diocese of Quebec, at its peak in 1712, covered the entire North American continent to the Gulf of Mexico, excluding British areas and that sort of thing.
Yep.
It was gigantic. It's hard for me to imagine how they would be able to keep up their enthusiasm facing such a huge challenge. I mean, there were thousands of Indian groups in that domain.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's absolutely overwhelming because the French, of course, were up in the Quebec region along the St. Lawrence River Valley. And then it's just this skinny swath that goes through the Great Lakes and then straight down the Mississippi, and not venturing too far out from the Mississippi, at least in the time frame that I'm working with. And so, and that was one of the downfalls of the French, was things were so thin and so scattered, and they didn't have very many people along the Mississippi compared to what they had in New England, for example. And of course, the Spanish were to the southwest and to the southeast. And so the French were thinly spread at that time. And Catholicism was equally thinly spread. If you think about where these French missionaries were, they were literally, there was one across from modern St. Louis, one at Arkansas Post, one on the Yazoo, one at Natchez, and then eventually somewhere at Mobile. So it was, 100+ miles apart for each one. Yeah.
Of course, anytime you study religious history, I think most people react with some degree of shock at the politics involved in it all, at the conflict within the various orders and so on. What we're talking about in this particular book is not all of the missionaries in the lower Mississippi Valley sent there by the French and others, but it's about this particular contingent that came out in 1698, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So early.
Yeah, very, very early. And the earliest, obviously, to go down the Mississippi and to establish themselves on the Mississippi, there were other missionaries that came down the Mississippi with La Salle and de Tonty and Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet, and they were, Jesuits and Franciscans, for example. But And people often misidentify these guys that I write about oftentimes. In fact, I was reading an article today, and there again, they referred to them as Jesuits. And I just write in the margin, no, they're not Jesuit. They are not Jesuit. They are seminary missionaries, not associated with an order, but associated with the Seminary of Quebec, which is also associated with the Foreign Missions Seminary in Paris. And so a different group of men, to say the least. Yeah.
Also, I was struck by how misfitted some of them were.
Yeah.
You know, just not the kind of folks you'd expect to set out in the late 1600s to an area that is basically undeveloped. It's raw in many, many ways.
Yeah. You know, it raises, you know, we don't really know exactly why the first three missionaries, or any of them for that matter, were sent down the Mississippi. We can question that. You know, St. Come was problematic when he was in Acadie. Seemed to have an interest in women, and they thought about sending him coded letters to try and convince him to get out of the priesthood. They hoped that he would recognize God's call within to step away from the priesthood. They thought about putting him in a house with marriageable women. They thought about all of these things, and eventually someone made the decision, let's send him down the Mississippi. And of course he goes to the Natchez and eventually seems to have fathered a child with the Sun King's sister. Whereas the opposite is true of Bergier. Father Bergier grew up in France, lived in a house of judges and lawyers, or a family of judges and lawyers. His father became a priest after his wife died, after Bergier's mother died. And so Bergier was exposed to religion throughout his entire life, became a lawyer, worked for the Grenoble Parliament, decided to become a priest, and everything you read about him that he wrote just signals a man who was deeply devout and wanted to succeed in his work with the native people. In fact, one of my favorite quotes in a letter that he wrote was, "My heart just blossoms when I see the native people." And so he, to me, stayed true to who he was throughout his entire time on the Mississippi, whereas St. Come was constantly shadowing himself, always talking about how bad the French people were, how bad the native people were, they're all debauched and everything, and yet he shadowed him on his own self in the end.
Well, one of the priests was murdered.
Two of them.
About that.
Two of them were murdered, actually. Father Foucault was murdered. He was the one who stayed with the Quapaw for about a year. He had not been very successful with the Quapaw and decided to leave them because Bienville and Iberville were looking to place a missionary among the Chickasaw. So as he and Dambournet left the Arkansas village, they had Koroa Indians as their escorts, and not too far away from the Quapaw village on the way down the Mississippi, they were murdered, presumably to get the goods that they had in their possession. The other one that was murdered was Father St. Come. He was murdered by the Chitimacha Indians on his way to Mobile. The reason why he was murdered was because the Chitimacha had been attacked by an eastern band of native people, could have been the Chickasaw or the Natchez, one or the other, or both, who were doing a slave run. And so the Chitimacha felt like the French had had a connection with that. And so they killed 6 French people, including St. Come, 6 arrows, I think, into his body as a result. Yeah, both of those were pretty horrific.
I know that you went to Quebec to do research. You went up to the archives in Quebec. Where else did you go in researching this book? Or what archives did you use?
Sure. I went to Quebec. I went to the Seminary Archives of Quebec, which is a World Heritage collection of archive materials that dates back to the 16th century. I went to Montreal, to the Jesuit Archives of Montreal. I went to Trois-Rivières, which is where they have the regional archives for Batiscan, and that's where Father Foucault served as a priest before he came down the Mississippi. I also went to Paris, to the Foreign Missions Archives in Paris. And at the time, the first time I went, I could actually look at the original document. But at the time, digital cameras didn't exist, so I couldn't take pictures. I could only get black and white copies. And I wish I had the original view of those, because now you can only look at microfilm. I also went to a tiny little archive in southeastern France in a tiny town called Vienne, and found that wonderful letter that Father Bergier wrote to his father just a few days after he arrived in Quebec, just a day or two after the first missionaries went down the Mississippi. It's a very beautiful letter that he wrote there. Also went to Aix-en-Provence, the Colonial Archives that are in southern France, and then also went to the Vatican and to the Propaganda Fide in Italy. And then also did some correspondence with the University of Moncton, which holds some of the material relevant to Acadie, which today is known as Nova Scotia. Yeah. There's nothing in America, in the United States, that's relevant to this topic. It's all abroad.
How did you find gaining access to these collections? How onerous was it?
That's a good question.
The French, at least, have the reputation of being rather protective, perhaps overprotective of their collections.
Yeah.
What experience did you have?
My first experience with archives was really in Quebec, and I had a wonderful experience there. I had to wear gloves with everything, and everything was in a single folder, and so you had to carefully turn your pages. There were two difficult ones. The most difficult was the Vatican. Number one, I didn't speak Italian. And number two, you could only look at 3 archives or 3 documents a day. And it was just very difficult, that experience there. Paris was fine. There again, you're limited. I think you can have 6 to 8 documents in Paris. You don't have to wear gloves in Paris. You know, each one seemed to be different. There was another archive that I went to, and I did pretty well. And then one day they decided they needed to sit right by me and turn the pages for me. I don't know what I did, but all of a sudden they had to do the page turning. So I thought, okay, we'll just let them turn the pages. But all in all, pretty good times at each one. But I think my favorite was the Quebec archives.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the priests and the Indians themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You make clear in the book that it's complicated. The motivations on the part of the Indians was also often multifaceted,
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't always a happy story.
No, it wasn't. Let me see if I can give you an example. The Bergier, you know, I love to talk about the Bergier story because of the 5 men. He's the one who has the most. He provides the most information. He's also the one of the 5 that you just really never read about.
And where did he go?
He was among the Tamarois. Today people refer to it as Cahokia, but the reason why I write it and call it Tamarois, the Tamarois village, is because they were the first to light the fire in that village, and at the time that's how they were referred to, as the Tamarois. Now
that would be in Illinois.
In Illinois, right across the river from St. Louis as we know it today. And so that's where Father Bergier was assigned. And Father Bergier was always questioning. And at the time, if you know much about that area and the history of that area, Father Gravier, who was a Jesuit, had been with the Illinois for a number of years. And so he had already been converting women, especially to Christianity. Marie Rouensart is probably the most famous Native American woman in that area to have been Christianized. She was forced into marrying Michel Acot, a Frenchman, and this by her father, who was the chief of that particular part of the village there, the Kaskaskia. And so Bergier there within the Tamarois village witnessed a lot of things, and himself had to start questioning himself and questioning his own faith and his own Catholicism. Because, for example, there was a young lady named Cecile She was a Kaskaskia woman, and she had been married to Paraflesh, who was a Peoria. So they'd been married for quite a while. In fact, I think they had 5 children, and there was one at her breast when he decided to divorce her. So he decides he wants to marry Sabine. So he marries Sabine in the traditional manner, and that's how Cecile had been married to him, in the traditional manner. Well, what happened was, it seems those 2 women were Christian, and all of a sudden, because Sabine had married Paraflesh, Cecile was no longer allowed to go to prayer. And so Father Bergier is walking along the Mississippi one day, and he encounters Cecile, and he says, "Hey, Cecile, why don't you go to prayer?" And she said, "Well, you in the black robes tell me I can't go because I'm the second wife. I'm no longer the first wife, I'm the second wife." And this is because Paraflesh and Sabine had ended up marrying in the church there. And so she literally put Bergier back on his heels. I can't really tell the story accurately. It's a little bit confusing, but basically what she said to him was she was a Christian. She had been good all of her life. She had her children, and that she was faithful to her husband is essentially what she said. And she put Bergier back on his heels. And so eventually what happened was Bergier turned around and said, there are 3 reasons why her marriage in the tradition of the Temera is good in the eyes of God. The 2 shall become one. This is blessed by God. And so that marriage he saw as just as good as a Christian marriage. And so he declared the Christian marriage of Paraflesh and Sabine no longer valid, and demanded that the 2 separate. And so that's what I really liked about Bergier and his relationship with the Temera, is that he was always thinking and trying to figure out what was going to work well for his Christian faith, but also for the native people. Another example, Temera women insisted that their children work on the Sabbath. They're just supposed to work on the Sabbath. And if they are following the Christian tradition and not working on the Sabbath, they would get a beating or a reprimand or whatever it would be. And so Father Bergier again found himself caught in this dilemma of, what do I do about this? Do I let them break the Sabbath and obey their parents? So he caught himself trying to decide, is this going to be a Sabbath-oriented decision, or is it going to be a 10 Commandment-oriented decision? So he was constantly thinking about these things there as well. No one else ever wrote like he wrote, and no one else ever described as well their interactions with the native people as did Bergier.
You seem to be really introspective. At the Quapaw village, though, there was a great deal of shock expressed over dress and dancing and some other aspects of Quapaw culture. And through some curves at the missionary.
Yeah, these missionaries basically were all priests first and foremost. And so by being priests first and foremost, they had expectations for their parishioners up in Quebec. Women had to have their necks covered, no frilly hats, dresses to the feet. Men had to be respectful, no drinking, no dancing, all of these things, very, very conservative. That was what the priests hoped for. But in the case of Quebec, there were a lot of problems with religion. The country churches, people would show up drunk, people would race their horses, people would shuffle their feet. If the sermon was long, they'd get up and sing loudly and that sort of thing. And so Foucault himself was very close to the bishop. And so with the bishop, he helped to write a number of ordinances that were meant to reprimand people for dressing inappropriately, singing inappropriately, and all this and all that. So here's Foucault, who's only ever known this rigidity. And he goes down the Mississippi, and he's placed among the Quapaw, who have the opposite of what he expects. In the summertime, a lot of nudity or very little dressing, a lot of dancing, a lot of singing, ceremonies and rituals that are very foreign to Foucault and very much against what he would want. And the same was true for other missionaries as well. Father de Montigny also struggled with this, with the Tansaw and the Natchez. And so one can assume when we talk about Foucault being mistreated by the Quapaw, one can assume that likely he wasn't mistreated by the Quapaw, nor was he abused by the Quapaw. More than anything, he was probably trying to get the Quapaw to change their ways, and that just wasn't going to happen. And so there was this, I'm sure, constant battle between him and the Quapaw to get them to participate in his religion. But even Father Gravier, the great Gravier, who wrote dictionaries and converted people in Illinois, he tried to teach the Quapaw, and all they would do was ignore him and tend to their pots. And he wrote about that. He said, I tried to get them to pray, and they just went away and worked in their pots or something like that. So that sort of thing was happening there.
I want to pivot a little bit, Linda, because I know that before this book, you actually did a little work on another aspect of Arkansas Post with a digital collection at Special Collections at U of A in Fayetteville. The French, I think it's called the French Ancestry Project, or
Colonial Arkansas Post Ancestry, CAPA.
Okay.
It's so meant to refer to CAPA, the first Quapaw village. Yeah.
And that was you were working with the Dorothy Core papers at Special Collections. Of course, Dorothy Core did a lot in the research of Arkansas Post and gathering information about the inhabitants and the settlers of Arkansas Post, the first families there.
Yeah, she was very tight with Morris Arnold. I think they wrote a book together. In fact, I think it's sitting over there on one of my countertops over there. She is the one who went out there and researched all the names and family names and so on and so forth, and did a lot of work with the Grand Prairie Historical Society, I believe, in that little journal that they put out. And so you were, I believe, the director of Special Collections at the time. And so we wanted to do more with the French material that was there in Special Collections. So I got a grant through the Arkansas Humanities Council to digitize a select number of those materials that are in that collection, because it's a pretty huge collection. And so we focused in on primarily, I think, the first half of the 18th century. And got a lot of that material there digitized. I don't remember the names of the different software tools that we had to use, but lots of keywords and censuses and things like that that were placed there. And I have used it in my classes quite a few times, have taught with that. And so it gives people an opportunity to look at some of the names and kind of see what their role was at Arkansas Post, or who they were married to and so on. But I'd love one day to go back and finish that up, because there's still so much more to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Is that accessible to the public?
Yes, it is. It's through Special Collections.
Through Special Collections. The online catalog will take you to it.
Yes. Yeah.
I would like to, you pivoted a little bit, and I would like to pivot a little bit. I'd like to go to the settlement of Mobile and the yellow fever epidemic.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where Detante died.
Right.
I had no idea that Detante, who died in 1704, he was engaged to be married.
So I have determined from some material, yeah. It doesn't sound like he ever got married, but that was at the time. That was 1704, August, September. Bienville was desperate to get women to come to Mobile to marry the Frenchmen, to try and start doing something down there to get the colony going. So I refer to them as the Pelican Girls. These were the first women that came over on the Pelican, the Pelican, which was a boat that came over from France. And many of them were married rather quickly. One died as soon as she got there from yellow fever. But others married pretty quickly, and then others chose to wait before they got married. But Bienville did get, Detante did get yellow fever. He did die, and Antoine Davillon, one of the priests in my book, is the one who performed the funeral for Henri Detante down there. And that was the old Mobile. That was the one that was further away from the Gulf than the one that's today, which would be where I believe Mobile is located today. Yeah. Yeah, disease was rampant up and down the Mississippi. They talk about the bloody flux. They talk about yellow fever. all sorts of different, of course, smallpox was on the Mississippi as a result of the Europeans being around. So a lot of horrific challenges physically, emotionally, environmentally for the missionaries. Yeah.
I can't imagine, traveling to Southeast Arkansas today and seeing the wilderness there. I can't imagine, that area and around Natchez back in the late 1600s, early 1700s.
The mosquitoes alone should have been enough to prevent any sort of colonization of the Mississippi Valley. You have a picture in your book.
I do.
A later image of some French travelers with nets over their heads.
Yeah, that actually comes from the Musée de la Civilisation, the Civilization Museum up in Quebec, which is where the archives are housed. And I just went to that website one day and I saw that image in color and I was like, oh my gosh, there's the cover of the book. Well, unfortunately, it couldn't be the cover of the book because it doesn't have anything to do with the title. But I love that picture. It actually comes from a book from the 19th century. And I love that image so much, I just had to include it in the book. And it is in color and it's beautiful in color. In fact, I thought it was a modern painting that somebody had done, but then I later determined it came from a book there. But it shows men in canoes on a waterway with veils over their heads and all these little bugs flying around their head, ready to snatch a piece of skin as soon as they can get through the veil. But that's what they suffered from all the time. Father de Montigny talks about horseflies by day, mosquitoes by night. They suffered from that. And yeah, you think about it today, if we go down to Southeast Arkansas, we can get pretty well chewed up by some mosquitoes, probably magnify that by 100, and that's what they probably had to suffer through because of all the inundation, the flooding and everything,
Later, you mentioned horseflies. Horseflies were a terrible scourge. One of the U.S. post riders riding between Arkansas posts, this is after 1800, after the Louisiana Purchase. One of the American post riders riding between Arkansas post and the new settlement of Little Rock, his horse was so driven mad by horseflies that the horse went wild and ran away and jumped into a river.
Smart.
That's a pretty horrifying thing to think about. If you've ever been bitten by a horsefly, you know how exceedingly painful it is.
It hurts, yeah.
These folks put up with a lot. I wanted to ask you what your thinking is for future projects.
Well, I do have an article coming out with Arkansas Historical Quarterly on a guy named Dan Bournay. Dan Bournay was one of Henri de Tonty's lieutenants, as you call him, and he was one of the ones who died alongside Foucault. So I think that might be coming out in the next edition of the Quarterly. I want to write an article on Jean Couture, and Jean Couture was the first French Arkansan, first Arkansas turncoat, and I'm starting to gather some information on him and what he was up to after he left Arkansas and went to hang out with the English over on the eastern side towards South Carolina and so on. I also
during the Revolutionary War.
Couture was one of the first people to. He was at Arkansas Post in 1686. He was there when it was first established. He was one of the leaders. He was the leader probably, along with Charles Delaunay.
But so you used the word turncoat. How did you mean that?
He left. He went to the side of the English. He left the French side and went over to the English side. Yeah, started trading with the English, with the Chickasaw. Tried to convince the Quapaw to turn on the French, and so on. And so I'd like to learn more about him. I'm working on an article right now on 17th century Arkansas communicated, and it's kind of a takeoff on Buzz Arnold's article 18th century Arkansas illustrated. But this is communication. In other words, how did the French and the Quapaw communicate when they didn't know each other's language? And so it's really kind of a fascinating story of thinking about signs and individual words and gestures and body language, symbolism and ceremony and ritual and interpreters, of course. So I'm working on that. And then I have a really big project I really need to get back to, and that's the French and Chickasaw War of 1739, 1740. I've collected about 8 to 10 journals that are relevant to that war. They're all in French, and they all are written by different people of different backgrounds who participated in that war. Engineers from Canada, Canadian leaders, French soldiers and French officers, Bienville as a colonial leader. So I want to look at that and look at how the French by this time are all greatly different accent by now, but they weren't necessarily the same people with the same ideas and goals in mind. And some call this the largest gathering of French people on the North American soil as a part of this war that really never ended up being a war. It ended up being more of a standoff with a very flimsy peace treaty being formed by the end of it. But it's from that war that we have Fort St. Francis, which was on the St. Francis River, which was burned by Bienville as they left the region. And I know that the archaeologists would love to find the remains of that fort, but they've not been able to find it. So that's kind of where I want to head with all that, yeah.
The Arkansas Historical Association is coming up in a couple of weeks. It'll be virtual, and I know that you're giving a couple of presentations during that. Are either of those related to your book or the same topic, or?
No, one of them will be on the language the communication aspect there. I'll be talking a lot about La Salle de Tonty, Marquette Joliet, and then Joutel, who was with La Salle in the failed attempt in Texas. And then the other one I'm doing with my colleague who is online here somewhere, Kathleen Condré, and another colleague, Ryan Calabretta-Sajar. We're looking at French, Italian, and German immigration into Arkansas. And so we'll be doing a panel together on that particular topic. Yep.
And so the Arkansas Historical Association, June 3rd through 5th, and if you're interested in that, you should go to the Arkansas Historical Association website and sign up. It'll be virtual this year.
It's very expensive this year, $15.
$15, yeah.
Worth it, very well worth it.
Yes. Linda, where can people order your book?
You can order my book. Did you want to look at that map, by the way? You can order
Let me share my screen right quick. And
you can order the book from LSU Press. You can also order the book from Amazon.com, Shattered Cross, Linda Carroll Jones. This is a map I wanted to briefly show y'all. This is actually in the book, and this is a map that was drawn about 1699, 1700 by either de Montigny or Bergier, and this shows basically in a very crude form a layout of where the native people were in turn of the century 17th into the 18th century. And so it just clearly shows this is where they were when they first encountered them. This is before, we know this is before the Kaskaskia moved to St. Louis and then moved below it because they're not mentioned here. So I've always enjoyed this because it's pretty much where the native people were at the time there along the Mississippi and then its tributaries that are there. Yeah.
Well, thank you for reminding me to do that. And there's another slide we were going to show. Actually, I found this map. It's 1715, but we talked about the Diocese of Quebec earlier.
Huge it was.
And it just really gives you an idea of, of course, going all the way to the Gulf, all the way up to what is now Canada. So,
Baffin Island, maybe.
Yeah. And when you look at that map, it just blows my mind to think about how they could leave Quebec, go down through Montreal, go into the Great Lakes, and then come on down all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, and then go all the way back up. That's just an incredible journey, an incredibly difficult journey with lots of portages, meaning they had to take their canoes out of the water and carry them over sometimes ice or stone bluffs and so on, and also had to carry all their gear with them as well. So it was not an easy feat by any means to go from Quebec to the Mississippi and then back up. In fact, it was of course far more difficult going back up, to be sure. Yeah.
Let me ask you real quickly, and we're getting short on time, but what were the ages of those missionaries when they departed?
They were I believe they were all in their 30s.
Okay.
Yeah, I think they were all in their 30s.
So they were all at a good age to embark on this.
Yeah, now Davion, they were all in their mid to late 30s. Davion, by the time he goes back to France, is into his 50s, or if not 60s. And he's the one who stayed there, much to his chagrin, for 25 years. He was begging 11 or 12 years into his stint to please send me back by the bowels of Jesus.
Uh-oh, we've got a problem.
I think we may have lost you, Linda. Well, we're gonna. She might come back. Her video is frozen right now, but there you are.
I'm here. Sorry, I'm here.
If anyone has any questions, I wanted to tell if anyone has any questions to put it in the chat box. And it looks like Kathleen says they could hear her. We couldn't hear you, but apparently everyone else could. But so go ahead. And what were you saying?
I think I was saying that Father Davion was the one who was so desperate to leave the Mississippi Valley. He just in 1711, I believe he wrote in 1711, by the bowels of Jesus Christ, please let me leave this place. And they didn't let him leave until 1725. And he's the only one who, he is the one who made it home, and then he died about a year later from some disease, gout probably or something. Yeah.
Just to remind people, it looks like we have I don't know if you can see, you can probably see the chat, Linda. It says, great fan of Dr. Jones and was honored to be a student under her lead. She is amazing. I would agree with that. You are amazing.
Oh, thanks. Jane, the student, was amazing, let me tell you. Yeah.
And we still have a few minutes for questions. So if you'd like to ask Linda a question, feel free to use the chat box. And while we're waiting to see if any questions come in, I put our email on the screen, ttwithtat@gmail.com. And so if you have any questions for Tom or myself, please feel free to email that. Or if you have maybe a topic that you'd like for us to address at a future show, please feel free to do that as well.
Yeah. And
we have a comment, very impressive scholarship from Jerry Hogan up in Fayetteville.
Oh, thanks, Jerry.
So, thanks, Linda. Really enjoyed your presentation. So, and I guess if anyone has any questions, we do have a question. Can you give an example of how they communicated with sign language?
Well, that's a great question. That's a very good question. The French, obviously, at the time had their own sign language. They had it through monasteries. They had it through trying to communicate with people who could not hear. Mariners, sailors had sign language as well. We have the Plains Sign Talk book. We actually have a copy of an original copy of that at Special Collections. And so some of the things that we had there were like, and this is a little bit later, but like a wagon would be seeing the circles go along as if that represents the wheels, or the bear, as you might imagine, or the ebu, or the frog is like hopping along. A fish would be swimming along like this. And so me, I can't remember all of them. I mean, obviously I can't. They're not too terribly unfamiliar. In other words, a lot of them had a lot of sense to them, if that makes sense. A lot of them had good sense that were pretty well understandable. And of course, in terms of direction and so on, the reason why we don't have a whole lot of Native American maps is because they would etch directions in the sand or in the dirt or something like that. But I was poking around in the Jesuit archives in St. Louis earlier today and actually came upon a couple of Native American drawn maps that they labeled in French. So I'm excited about that because I'm actually I forgot to mention that. I'm working on a book right now. It's called an open educational resource book, which means it's written for my class and it's distributed to students for free. And it's going to be on communication between the French and the native people, an ethnohistoric study. And so there is a chapter on maps, and it's devoted to Native American maps.
Interesting. We have one last question. Did you encounter any information about the French moving up the valley of the Washita River?
You know, that's a great question. I grew up along the Washita River Valley, and I know that I don't know how to pronounce his name. We call it Philoel Hall. I went to Northeast Louisiana, and the building that I did all my French coursework in was called Philoel Hall, I believe, Filhiol. And he's the one who established the post at Washita, or the Washita Post there in Monroe. And I just don't know a whole lot about it. I know it exists. I'd like to learn more about it. It's just not been the area I've been in just yet. We also have, information we need to find out about it in terms of the Red River French, what they were up to as well. Yeah.
Well, Linda, thank you for being here. We really enjoyed having you here.
Very fun. Thank you so much.
I got to get to my Canadians. Speaking of Canada, I got to get to my Canadians hockey game.
Well, we appreciate your dressing for the occasion.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, you bet. You bet. All right. Well, thanks. I had a great time.
Thank you, Linda.
Bye, Linda.
Before we let you go tonight, everyone that we let you go, want to remind you about next month is June 17th is the next episode of this. And we will be talking about Arkansas artists and art. And we'll have Russ Aikman, who is an art collector, Arkansas art collector, on.
Russ, who is a resident of Dallas area, Dallas or Fort Worth, grew up in the Whitehall area. He has become a very interested collector of Arkansas art, and I think he's going to be a lot of fun. He'll have a lot of illustrations.
Cool.
And should be great.
Yeah, and I think we're going to share some of our own favorite.
Some of our own art,
yeah, that we like. We have in our own houses. So, well, thank you all for being here tonight. We appreciate it again, Linda. Thank you for being here, and we hope to see everyone next month. Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.